All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to DEP's webinar on the Natural and Working Land Strategy. I'm Heather Genovich. I'm a research scientist in the Division of Science and Research at New Jersey DEP, and I've had the pleasure of working with some of DEP's finest from across the department on developing the Natural and Working Land Strategy. This is the second of 4 stakeholder meetings on the strategy. Now, the purpose of this meeting is to go over the targets or the goals that we have developed for the strategy and to get feedback from all of you, the people who work in these fields every day. The primary purpose of the strategy is to maximize carbon sequestration in New Jersey's natural and working lands. Now, when I first started working on this project, the term working lands was new to me. For anybody else who might be uncertain what that means, working lands include farms, certain forests, and any other lands from which we get products. This strategy will lay out specific actions that can maximize sequestration on public lands with some opportunities for private lands as well. And one thing I'll mention before we get started here, you may find that you can navigate through the slides independently. If you find that you're on a slide that's different from the presenter and you want to catch up to where the presentation is, you just hit sync to presenter. All right, so before we really dig in, I want to let everyone know that this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on our website along with the presentation materials. The last time I checked, we had about 150 people registered for the meeting. Those included representatives from conservation groups, environmental consultants, government agencies, universities, and more. We're really pleased to have folks from all these sectors here to help guide the strategy. In a meeting this large, it's important that we cover some ground rules. We are using the webinar format in Teams, which means that attendee microphones and cameras are off by default. You can provide comments or ask questions in the chat at any time, but we ask that you limit discussion to the topics that we're covering today. There will be a time for folks to raise their hands and ask questions verbally, and this will be when you see a slide with a big orange question mark on it. I'll call on people one at a time and temporarily allow microphone privileges, but then on your end, you'll also have to turn your mic on. Our main purpose for being here today is to share the progress we've made on the strategy and to hear from you. We will consider every bit of input that we receive, but we will not issue a response document. After these 4 meetings, we're going to take back your comments, integrate them where appropriate, and continue writing the strategy. Its release is planned for late in the 3rd quarter of 2023. Now, if you find you have additional comments after the meeting, there is a comment form on our website, and I'll give you some more details on that later in the presentation. So this last link here is going to come up several times. Aiden, if you're able to drop that in the chat, I'd appreciate it. So again, my name is Heather Genovich. Up next, Tony Rowe is going to discuss the impetus for the strategy and how it fits in with DEP's climate initiatives. Mattia Jepsen will give an overview of what will be in the strategy and how we developed our targets. Mattia will be followed by Frank McLaughlin and Katie Hogue, who will provide the meat of the presentation today and go over the targets for developed lands. You can type your comments or questions in the chat at any time, but we'll wait to call on raised hands until after they're finished. I'll wrap up the meeting with a focus on what's next and how you can review the targets and submit comments online. So now I'm going to pass the mic to Tony.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So I work for the Bureau of Climate Change at DEP. I'm one of the research scientists there, and I'm just going to talk a few slides about the background of all this. Bear with me. So the state's climate action is guided by a series of greenhouse gas reduction goals. The global warming response act calls for New Jersey to do a couple of things. One, reduce our statewide greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels. That's approximately 112 million metric tons of CO2 by year 2020. And the second one is to reduce our statewide greenhouse gas emissions by 80% below the 2006 level. Sorry, something's not working here. Here we go, which is approximately 24.2 million metric tons by 2050. In 2021, Governor Murphy further strengthened the state's reduction commitments by signing Executive Order 274, which established an interim greenhouse gas reduction target by 50%, which is below the 2006 levels, which is approximately 60.4 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030. The good news is New Jersey reached its first climate goal, the 2020 greenhouse gas reduction targets, by reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 25% between the year 2006 and 2020. However, meeting the ambitious goals for reducing the emissions by 50% by 2030 and then another 80% by 2050, it's going to require an economy-wide transformation that demands all economic sectors, governments, companies, communities, individuals to accept and adopt fundamental changes in how we consume energy, produce, generate waste, and interact with our natural lands. So in this slide, in 2020, DEP released a report. It's called the Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 report. In this report, it identifies the different pathways to achieve the 80 by 50 reduction goal. It evaluates 7 emission sectors of New Jersey's economy. It models how the state can achieve these reductions in those sections and provides specific policy recommendations for action. So within the report, it lays out 3 major pathways to greenhouse gas emissions reduction. One is replacing fossil fuel vehicles with electric vehicles. That's shown by that first picture towards the left. Those are the 3 sections. Converting space and water heating in the residential and commercial building sectors through electric heat. And number 3, replacing fossil fuels in the electric power generation sector with renewable sources. However, even if we achieved all of these major transitions, New Jersey will not reach its greenhouse gas reduction goals without significant protection of our natural working lands. Carbon sequestration is needed to offset our gross emissions, and those are the 2 graphs towards the right. So that's the major pathways that we've identified to help Jersey reach these goals. And next, I'm going to pass it off to, well, not yet. I got one more slide. Sorry. So since 2020, Jersey DEP released a series of reports and plans to identify and address climate change. A common thread throughout these major reports is the role that the state's natural working lands plays in capturing and storing greenhouse gases, providing resilience and ecosystem services. The 2020 Science Report on Climate Change identifies to natural lands from a changing climate. The 2020 Global Warming Response Act identifies the role carbon sequestration will play in achieving out greenhouse gas reduction goals. The 2020 RGGI Strategic Funding Plan, this one identifies a steady stream of funding to enhance the state's forests and tidal wetlands through various projects, restoration projects. The 2021 Climate Resilience Strategy identifies the role of nature-based solutions to support resiliency goals. Additionally, the Jersey Wetlands Program Plan and the Forest Action Plan both evaluate and consider the roles these lands provide in protecting carbon sequestration. And last but not least, the Natural Working Land Strategy takes the work of these reports even further by strengthening the state's commitment to protecting and enhancing the carbon pools in these natural lands through the adoption of carbon sequestration, targets by land types, and identifying actionable land management practices. The strategy will in turn be utilized as a positive feedback to inform future iterations of these plans to develop of incentive programs and regulatory policies. And now I'll pass it off to Mattia.
Thank you, Tony. Okay. So my name is Mattia Jepsen. I'm a wetland scientist and a bureau chief in the Division of Science and Research at the New Jersey DEP. And I'll be talking a little bit about what the carbon sequestration basics, and then what we've been working on in the natural working land strategy and how we've picked the parts of our strategy so far. So in terms of carbon sequestration, plants pull carbon dioxide out of the air as part of photosynthesis. And that carbon is stored in their leaves and in their roots and in the plant biomass. As the leaves and other parts of the plants die, they get incorporated into the soil. The living and dead plant material, along with fungus and microbial biomass, are all considered to be sequestered carbon. Some of that stored carbon is re-released into the atmosphere when plants and soil microbes respire, so when they break down that carbon that's been stored. And it can be re-released as carbon dioxide, methane, or other gases. When natural and working lands are disturbed by natural or human activities, there can be a decrease in the rate of carbon storage and/or an increase in the re-emission of stored carbon. But sound land management practices can be used to protect the stored carbon and to increase the rate of carbon storage. And so you can see that in this cycle here. And so what we're looking for is a net sequestration. So for natural and working lands for the strategy, the habitat types that we are including are forests, agriculture, wetlands, developed lands, and aquatic habitats. As Heather mentioned, today we're focusing on developed lands, and we have a total of 4 of these meetings so that we cover each one of these topics. The upcoming ones are on agriculture and forests. And last week we did sessions on wetlands and aquatic habitats, which have been recorded and will be posted on the website. So in order to help jumpstart land management practices that will increase carbon sequestration, the New Jersey DEP has been working collaboratively with the New Jersey Department of Agriculture for the past 2 years to draft this evolving natural and working land strategy. So the strategy, as Tony mentioned, identifies detailed actions that can mitigate the impacts of climate change through carbon storage and sequestration. So we were looking at specific land management practices, the opportunities to develop new programs, new policies, and other activities that could be implemented by state agencies that would increase our carbon storage and carbon protection in our natural and working lands. So in this way, we're hopeful that the state will be in a better position to meet the 80 by 50 emissions targets, as Tony mentioned. The recommendations in the natural and working land strategy are expected to be broadly applicable to other groups that manage land as well. So landowners and land managers, nonprofits, universities, policymakers from all different jurisdictions are also considered to be key audiences for the strategy. So we kicked off the development of the natural and working land strategy in May of 2021, and we put out a scoping document and held a webinar in December of 2021 that basically laid out what we were planning to do and how we were planning to get there. We requested feedback from the community on that, and then we incorporated the comments that we got as we have been developing the strategy. So since December of 2021, we have been working on our list of recommendations and developing targets for those recommendations. The targets say how much of what type of activity we want to accomplish by when. And now that we've developed those, we are in the stakeholdering phase over here. And we hope to, we'll be wrapping up the stakeholdering next week, and then we will take all of the comments that we receive and use them to refine our recommendations and targets, and then write up the strategy, which we expect to be released in the 3rd quarter of 2023. So I wanted to briefly discuss all of the work that the different work groups at the Department of Agriculture and DEP that they have put into developing the strategies that are being presented currently. So first, we pulled together all of the other natural and working land strategies that we could find. So any other government, state, international, NGO recommendations on how to sequester carbon in natural and working lands. We ended up with a massive list of hundreds and hundreds of policies and land management activities that people had included. Then we put together work groups, one for each of the habitat types, and those work groups honed the list for New Jersey. So they made sure that they were covering habitat types that we actually have in New Jersey. So for example, we removed anything that had to do with mangroves because we don't have mangroves this far north. So they took a look at the list and really picked things that were going to be most applicable for New Jersey. Then with that refined list, they did some carbon modeling where available and some literature searches and attempted to take a look at the carbon benefit of those land management practices. Originally, in the scoping document, we had said that we were going to do some extensive modeling to look at the benefits, but we ended up with so many different land management activities. It ended up being a much larger lift than we could fit into the time frame of developing this first iteration of the strategy. So our goal is to work on that over the next few years, but we only wanted to include strategies that had scientific peer-reviewed backing that there would be net carbon sequestration from those practices in this first iteration. So we looked at the list of recommendations and found literature that discussed the carbon benefits of those actions. And then we also got an idea of the ballpark of the cost of doing those activities. And we also thought about the scalability. So is this something we can do on 100 acres in New Jersey, or is it something that we can do on 100,000 acres in New Jersey? And we ranked those. So each one of these buckets got a 1, 2, or a 3. And then those were used to decide what would make it into the recommendation list for the natural working land strategy. So again, we wanted to make sure that there was documented evidence that there would be a net carbon sequestration benefit, that it was not prohibitively expensive, that we could do it and was broadly applicable in New Jersey. And we also wanted to make sure that there would be benefits to the ecosystem. So we're not trying to do something that's going to have negative impacts to biodiversity and wouldn't have negative impacts to the people who are living in the communities. Once we had that list, we went back in and the work groups filled out some fact sheets about the who, what, where, when, why, how of these recommendations. They filled out a section on potential impediments to implementation, gave some consideration to what kind of impacts these activities would have on overburdened communities with the environmental justice lens, thought about how climate change might impact the effectiveness of these activities over time, and again, thought about trade-offs with ecosystem services and people. And then we selected targets. So the targets were selected for, especially for the land management activities. So for example, how many rain gardens did we think we could install by 2030 and how many could we install by 2050? And we picked those targets because they were in line with the targets that New Jersey has for greenhouse gas reduction in the state. And so that is what we'll be presenting to you today, is these lists of land management and policy and program activities that have been developed for the natural and working lands. And with that, I will turn it over to Heather.
Thank you, Mattia. So before Frank and Katie really dive into the details on all of these targets for developed lands, I have a couple questions that I want you all to keep in the back of your mind. We want to know if there's anything missing from our draft list of targets. So if you have any suggestions, just remember that we are looking for things that have published scientific literature confirming a net sequestration benefit, but we are looking most for what might we be missing. And then also, are there any targets that you think really don't belong on these lists? And if you see anything like that, let us know why. So to improve the chances of succeeding in meeting these targets, we need to identify and address key obstacles to achieving them. We're wondering what obstacles you might foresee. And we also know that these changes will come at a cost. We'll need to pair funding mechanisms with our targets. So we want to hear about any potential sources of funding that you are aware of. So now I'm going to hand off the mic to Frank and Katie. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Mattia. Thanks, Tony. Thanks for all your work on this important endeavor. My name is Frank McLaughlin. I manage the Office of Brownfields and Community Revitalization. It's housed within the Contaminated Site Remediation and Redevelopment Program. I have been at the department for almost 35 years, 20 of years of which has been doing urban land reclamation in the Brownfields office. So I've overseen many successful reclamations of land and also infrastructure in places like Camden, New Jersey. So the good news is that we can reuse developed lands for beneficial reuses, from open spaces to riparian corridor improvements to water infrastructure to urban forests to many other benefits that not only benefit the local air quality, temperatures, stormwater quality, stormwater volume, but also are good for the planet too, because reusing our urban lands has a much lower carbon footprint than traditional development across New Jersey and other places. For people who look at carbon footprints, the carbon footprints in New Jersey are lowest in Hudson County by far, and they're highest in our rural and suburban communities. So the good news is that having people and having productive lands in already developed areas is good for New Jersey, good for the planet. In addition to the environmental benefits from doing work in developed lands, there are also social, economic, public health, equity and justice, and quality of life benefits that are seen in these communities when there are environmental improvements. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details, but again, doing urban work and developed land work is good for that community, good for the region, and good for the planet because of reducing carbon footprints and saving green space from development and other benefits, again, like air temperature, stormwater quantity and quality. There is already a lot of productive urban forests in New Jersey, already sequestering lots of carbon. There is also a very large inventory of urban vacant lands and brownfields, which I'll discuss in a moment, for additional carbon sequestration and other improvements. Our working group, unfortunately, lacks research studies on carbon sequestration in the built environment. So some of the data we're going to share with you today is actually calculated from our own measurements at our own projects in urban communities like Camden. Okay, I'm moving to the next slide here. So I in my work at DEP, working with all programs within DEP. When you're in the brownfields world, you work with the land use program, the air and climate programs, you work with the water programs, you work with natural historic resource programs, and many times there's an underappreciation of the issues and the conditions in urban communities. So this is a picture of the North Camden neighborhood. That's the Ben Franklin Bridge for folks who travel from South Jersey to Philadelphia. This picture is a vacant residential properties and brownfields, and I'll talk about brownfields in a moment. But we should never forget that when you see a distressed community, it usually also is related to a distressed environmental conditions. So there are equity, environmental justice, and other issues often related with developed lands. Not all, of course. There's many productive urban communities and suburban communities, but I think it should be pointed out that the most environmentally distressed areas are often the most economically and socially stressed areas. As you can see from this slide, and typical of more urban, but also sometimes suburban development, there's a lack of tree canopy, permeable and healthy soils, wildlife habitat, open spaces, and other amenities that maybe many of us take for granted in our communities. Reclaiming urban and developed lands, again, not only can improve the environmental conditions, including carbon sequestration, but also be an engine for community revitalization. And just as a general statement, urban redevelopment is much more climate friendly than traditional greenfield development, developing our available agricultural lands, woodlots. So if you look at almost any measure, but carbon footprint probably the best, urban redevelopment and infill development or suburban areas is far superior to the planet than traditional greenfield development. So brownfields are vacant or underutilized former industrial or commercial properties that are often contaminated. And there are tens of thousands of brownfield sites in New Jersey and roughly 500,000 across the country, estimated by our friends at the Environmental Protection Agency. So in addition to vacant lands or underutilized lands, there's a large inventory of brownfield sites. As you can see from the slides, they often are covered with impervious surfaces or compacted urban soils. These compacted soils don't support healthy vegetation, and there's also things like stormwater runoff, fugitive dust, and other things. They have currently a much lower carbon content in the soil profile and also obviously in the lack of vegetation. So improvements can be significant and dramatic in urban lands, brownfields, and vacant underutilized properties in our developed areas. So there are tremendous opportunities for carbon sequestration. Overall, if we want to see economic growth, and most of us do, that growth is actually better in urban areas, which don't take up our valuable green fields, while we reuse and often enhance the environment while we do urban and brownfields redevelopment. And there are a number of co-benefits to urban redevelopment, from stormwater management, urban temperatures, air temperatures, and again, growth, economic growth, and revitalization of communities. And this is one of the projects that my office has worked on. This is the former General Cable site in Perth Amboy on the Arthur Kill, before and after photos. So the unproductive impervious surfaces were removed. The contaminated soil was removed. Improved soil conditions were placed there. Now, this project was primarily a project for active recreation, because Perth Amboy lacked both active recreation and, in this part of Perth Amboy, access to their waterfront. But in other projects, we have done as much as 62 acres of new forested parks in places like Camden, New Jersey. So this is just one of many examples of a brownfield site that was causing water pollution, stormwater runoff, no vegetation. So it was contributing to the urban heat island effect, and now is active recreation. But again, we've done many natural plantings as well, from green infrastructure to new passive recreation parks on brownfields and vacant lands. So again, have the opportunity to sequester carbon is great in urban areas too, and I think sometimes that's underappreciated. And again, there's lots of co-benefits beyond environmental improvements. Excuse me for a second. We have working with Heather, Mattia, and Katie, who is a colleague of mine in the Office of Brownfields and Community Revitalization, have honed down 6 recommendations for developed urban lands. Green infrastructure like rain gardens and vegetative swales. Street trees, shade trees. That's a picture also in North Camden on Erie Street, near where the picture I showed you earlier was. They're examples of shade trees planted about 10 years ago along that street. Tree trenches, tree boxes. Typically, tree trenches are sunken in existing parking lots lower than the current grade to not only collect stormwater, but also to be a healthy place to grow trees. We have many examples of brownfields that have been transformed to open spaces and other productive reuses while amending the past contamination at this site. There's also many examples of soil amendments and improvements from vacant residential lots to brownfield sites. And also there are existing park systems in urban areas that can be enhanced or new parks created, many of them on brownfield sites. This is one of the projects we've done in South Camden. This is the Waterfront South neighborhood. So this is the poorest community in the poorest city in New Jersey. And even in the poorest cities and the poorest neighborhoods, many of the residents want greening, trees, reforestation, open space. They want to be able to walk to their beautiful natural resources in their communities. And this was a small gas station that was abandoned for many years, that was remediated and turned into a small pocket park, and also for rain gardens that accept the stormwater from the streets and manage the stormwater on the site. So we went from almost a half of acre of completely impervious surface coverage, unproductive, few trees, no exposed soil, to in 2012, when we first did the project, is the slides to your left. And in 2022, that's the picture of the park and one of the rain gardens at the park. And happy to answer any detailed questions that you might have about brownfield remediation or other things later. And we've done some carbon sequestration calculations for street trees, green infrastructure and parks, and I'm going to let my colleague Katie Hogue discuss them. Katie is an environmental specialist with the Office of Brownfields and Community Revitalization, and a recent graduate with her master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania. Katie?
Hi, everybody. I'm Katie. So when Frank and I went out to Waterfront South Rain Gardens Park in November, we took measurements to calculate how much carbon dioxide has been sequestered at this park. So we did this by getting the DBH on each of the trees and measuring the tree height using a method with a yardstick. And then I found some calculation formulas based on research papers and different university publications. I specifically went with the one from the University of New Mexico. And so the methods of that are in the top right of this slide. So we were able to measure the carbon sequestered in the standalone trees in the park. There's not yet methodology to see how much carbon's been sequestered by grasses, shrubs, and things of that nature. So our estimate of how much carbon's been sequestered is probably on the low end, but I calculated and estimated 63.06 tons that have been sequestered by standalone trees in this park. And then to put it into perspective, 1 ton of carbon dioxide is equal to 23,000 miles in the average car. And then you can see that on the bottom left, just a bunch of different other things. So it's a lot of carbon dioxide been sequestered in this park. But there's also like complexity in these variables because there's lack of species-specific research on different trees, because different trees will sequester different amounts of carbon, which there should be funding put into place to figure this out. But yeah, this is why I call it an estimate. And then the greatest carbon dioxide gets sequestered in younger stages of tree growth. So this park is only 10 years old, so it's quickly sequestered a lot of carbon. And then it also depends on local conditions and health and management of the tree. So as Frank was talking about, soil amendments are really important, because if the soil is healthy, then the trees and the other vegetation will be healthy on top. We also measured the CO2 weight of street trees on 2 Camden city blocks and 1 other park. The one block had 9 trees, and I calculated 5.45 tons of carbon dioxide, and then the other block had 6 trees, which I calculated 5.7 tons. And then in the park, which was Cooper Sprouts Park in Camden, it had 2 weeping willow trees that were planted about 10 years ago. They got so big that they sequestered an estimated 63 tons of carbon dioxide, which is the amount of this park. So here's our recommendation types that Frank briefly mentioned earlier. The first one being our green infrastructure, installing rain gardens and vegetated swales. And then the numbers on the right are the based on information available on projects that have already been completed. So for rain gardens, they're one of the more heavily researched forms of green infrastructure, with studies showing their ability to have positive net carbon intake over the course of their whole life cycles. So from the rain garden being built to then like absorbing stormwater and growing, the carbon is positive. The intake of the carbon is positive. They also are able to absorb 1 million gallons of water per acre annually, improve soils, provide open space, provide habitat for birds that might be stopping over on migration, or even resident birds. They help curb urban heat island effects and stabilize distressed neighborhoods. They're also successfully implemented in environmental justice communities because they don't take up too much room, and they can be placed successfully on contaminated and brownfield sites, which has been shown. And then for the next recommendation, the street trees and shade trees, they're perfect for developed lands because they require minimal space. And with the proper tree selection, sequestration can be maximized at a low cost. So you want trees that have like a larger canopy cover and grow big, but not too big, as they can cause breaking in the sidewalk and distress communities further. So that's why the species-specific research is pretty important, especially for developed lands. Our targets for street trees and shade trees, they may seem really large, 250,000 trees by 2030, but the reason that we thought this was doable was because since 1998 to present day, so in about 20 years, the New Jersey Tree Foundation alone planted 203,000 street trees across New Jersey with a survival rate of 95%. So if more groups were to work together, like including the state government, like I think that this target is very doable. Our next recommendation, tree trenches and tree boxes. They take up a little bit more room than a street tree, but they're also really, really helpful for stormwater management and help curb like runoff and flooding in these distressed communities. So Philadelphia's Water Department Green Cities Clean Water Initiative has planted 172 tree trenches in 2 years. That was between 2011 and 2013. Our targets were a little lower than that because Philadelphia is able to do this thanks to a stormwater management fee that's not in New Jersey. But tree trenches are super helpful for a variety of reasons. And then Frank mentioned brownfield remediation into parks and open space, turning a place that once sequestered 0 carbon and even was hazardous to like the environment around it into a green space that would absorb carbon through trees, their amended soils, vegetation, and even become like a habitat for like a variety of wildlife. If anybody knows about Kramer Hill Waterfront Park, which was the 62 acres of brownfield site that Frank mentioned earlier, it's now great for like bird watchers that you can go see eagles. There's plenty of fish species. There, geese are there all the time. Like there's even been a sighting of an otter over there. And this is not things that you'd expect to see in like an urban community like Camden. And there's other successful examples of brownfields to park projects like Berry Lane Park in Jersey City, and you have Nat Turner Park in Newark, Whitman Park in Camden, Gateway Park in Camden, Plainsboro Farm in Plainsboro. The list goes on. So then for amending soils, our numbers here are 750 acres by 2030 and 5,000 by 2050 are just based on the HDSRF funded brownfields to parks only, which has been 553 acres of soil in 10 years. They don't include soil amendments that have been done for other redevelopment projects, so this number could be higher. This is just based on the information that we were able to access. But soil amendments would not only maximize the amount of carbon stored in the soil, but for things on top. And as Frank mentioned, compacted soils in urban land does not support vegetative cover. There's also a lot of abandoned residential lots in urban communities between houses. As you've seen in the earlier photo, there was all the houses with the wide gap in the middle. The soils there could be amended, and then people could plant their own gardens, trees, like whatever they wanted, and that would sequester a lot of carbon in those spaces. And then finally, we had preserving and enhancing existing green space like urban parks and forests. It's important to keep existing carbon sequestered, and it's also an opportunity to enhance carbon sequestration processes in these parks. A lot of these parks are older and in need of rehabilitation. Some of them will have contaminated soils, or they were built on historic fill, so they're not as productive as they could be. And this is an opportunity to connect or enlarge existing parks to improve habitat connectivity, which is really good for forest interior species of birds. For example, they can't survive when the habitat is so fragmented. It's also good for recreation and transportation of people who might walk to work in the morning, like if they have a park trail to walk through. I know that can bring up a lot of people's spirits during the day. So we start off these they may require remediation prior to carbon sequestration improvements, and then that brownfields may also have to have an investigation. So this is just extra funding that would have to be put in place to enact these targets. So I'm going to pass it back to Frank to discuss our policy recommendations.
Thanks, Katie. I know we presented a lot of information quickly, so we are going to be available to answer questions, and there's a lot of variety in the projects that we have done and that can be done in urban and developed lands, and I think that's also really exciting, right? There is many different projects. We have done developed land projects in every major city and many of the suburban communities around New Jersey, just taking brownfield sites and beneficially reuse them. And those 6 recommendations we have, the biggest impediment currently is funding. All this remediating the, even Superfund sites, which our office has done work with other people in our program doing those. Some of the largest landfills in the state, some of the most complex brownfield sites along urban waterways, all of those we know how to remediate and improve the environment. Sometimes local communities need housing, they need schools, they need community centers, they need ratables, mixed use development, but the environment is also something they want to see improved. At a minimum, more open space, but many communities want to see greening, urban forests, waterfront trails and access. So all the recommendations that we have done, even though they sound a little complicated to investigate and remediate a site to become a new park, we have done this dozens of times across the state. So we would like to see new funding go towards carbon sequestration and other projects on developed urban lands. We're very happy that the commissioner and the governor used the regional greenhouse gas emissions to fund some carbon sequestration grants. We are going to be planting like over 1,000 trees in tired parks in Camden with one of those grants, and we look forward to more opportunities like that. Katie mentioned a stormwater management fee, which now legislation in New Jersey allows. And cities like Philadelphia, but there are many other ones also who have done a lot of great urban environmental improvements through stormwater fees. We have existing funding, both state and federal funding, that can investigate and clean up brownfield sites. And in New Jersey, it's a hazardous discharge site remediation fund, which my office administers, but we work closely with our EPA counterparts. The infrastructure bank also funds not only green infrastructure improvements and of course gray infrastructure improvements, but also brownfield remediation. We have partnered with the Green Acres program, the Blue Acres program, the Office of Natural Resource Restoration, and doing settlements to do urban land reclamation. So there is a lot of existing funding, but if we want to do what we all hope to see, which is improve the environment, particularly under stressed communities in New Jersey, increased existing funding is also necessary. We mentioned that there is a dearth of research on urban land carbon sequestration. So some additional research is probably going to be needed so we can target our benefits even more. And I think we're going to pass it back to Heather. But we're going to be around to answer questions and to do our best to answer questions, because this developed lands obviously very varied, but also tremendous opportunities. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thanks so much, Frank and Katie. That was a lot to take in, but in such a densely populated state, your work is really important. So I've been watching the chat here, and a few folks have asked about your calculations for sequestration and whether they align with the iTree tool. Do you happen to know if the sources that you used for the calculations are consistent with that?
I'm going to let Katie answer that because she is the expert.
So I'm not sure if they align with iTree. I have used iTree in the past. I based it on different publications by universities that they use for their biology classes and stuff. I can link that in the chat if anybody is interested in seeing it. I'm not sure exactly what specific formulas iTree uses, but I know there's a couple other websites similar to iTree that there was a research paper that compared them and their carbon sequestration values to see how they differed. I can also link that too if anybody's interested in reading it, because there's no one set formula right now because it's very different by species of tree. And that hasn't been like fully studied yet. But yeah, I'll link the different research I've done.
Thanks, Katie. And I will add that Katie and Frank are a step ahead here with starting to figure out how much sequestration is happening in these lands. Mattia touched on it briefly earlier, but that's something that we plan to incorporate in a later iteration. So right now we've just identified practices that can sequester and store carbon, but we're not quantifying how much these changes will pull out of the atmosphere in this step. There's also some questions about what documents will be posted and the processes for commenting. So I'll go through that a little bit more in the next few slides.
Feel free to raise your hands if you would like to make any comments or have any questions that you'd like to speak verbally.
And also one person had recommended inviting the Ag board. I'm sorry, I wrote down the name of it. During the meeting, I reached out to our ag contact for the meeting Thursday, and we're going to make sure that they are included. That sounds like the perfect audience for weighing in on this. There is a question here from John about whether we're targeting lawn conversions and that there is more lawn than what's needed for recreation. Lawn is poor for stormwater and sequestration.
Well, we agree with that. Much of the lawn is in private hands. So I think it might be worth looking at, especially public lands first. But I don't think that's, I think that's a good idea. You know, we have a lot of impervious surface coverage that are even poor in carbon sequestration. So we're starting almost with the worst first, but we would like to, we think there's improvements possible there too.
Okay, we've got a Mary Charlotte Gitlin has their hand up. I'm going to see. Oh, did we already? Oh, okay. Go ahead, Mary.
Can you guys all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. My name is Mary Charlotte Gitlin. I'm with Paul Cowie and Associates. We're consulting urban foresters and arborists in New Jersey. My question relates to kind of maintenance of all of these things, particularly trees, right? Because in my line of work, we see a lot of big hazardous trees in communities that don't always have the resources to address them. So has that been considered? I guess that's primarily a funding thing. And how has that been considered in these targets?
That's a good question, Mary. That hasn't been considered in our initial assessments. Most of the urban land work we've done so far has been we've only been doing this work for about 10 to 15 years. So our street trees, our park trees, our rain gardens have fairly smaller trees right now. But of course, I had to take out about 5 ash trees on my own suburban property a few years ago. So that's a good question. We do have a urban forestry program at DEP and a nonprofit that's in but not of DEP, New Jersey Tree Foundation. I would have to defer to those experts about large hazardous trees and how we fund them right now.
And Mary, I'm going to chime in as well. You will find there's some overlap between the different land types with these targets. So there's also a forestry work group that's going to have a meeting just like this this coming Tuesday. And I have heard them talk about maintenance being an issue with urban forestry. I know it's something that they've considered, how they're dealing with that, how they're funding it, you know, how that's a part of their program. I can't provide details on, but I'm sure they'd be able to answer that more in depth if you're able to come on Tuesday.
Okay, thank you so much. I am familiar with those DEP programs that you mentioned, so thank you.
Sure, and I'll pass your concern along anyway, whether you can come or not.
Awesome, thank you so much.
So while folks give some more thought to, you know, anything else that needs to be included that we might have missed, I'm going to just run through what's coming next here. So today's meeting is on developed land. The last 2 meetings that we'll hold are for agriculture and forestry, which are this Thursday, then this coming Tuesday. We're going to request that any comments are received by April 14th. So anything that you offer today, whether it be verbally or the text, we'll consider a comment. We also have a comment form on our website. There's also a comprehensive list of the draft targets available there. So that really is the meat of this strategy. That's what we're looking for comments on, and we'll go ahead and incorporate everything that we receive and get working on that final strategy, which should be expected later this year, sometime in the third quarter, probably later in that quarter. This is the same link we've thrown up for just about everything. So we also expect to post recordings and presentation slides. Look for those by the first week of April. Now, if you do want to submit comments after the meeting, on our website, you go down to the buttons where you've registered for these webinars, and there's a drop down that says comment on New Jersey's NWLS stakeholder sessions. And that will drop down and give you all of these fields where you can submit your information. And again, we are not issuing a response to comment document, so we really appreciate all the input. We'll do our best to incorporate it. So we're gonna leave the line open for a little while here, see if anybody else has any other questions or comments they'd like to provide.
Heather, there's a question in the chat from Connor Smith. So about 70,000 acres of New Jersey land is owned by the Department of Defense. Has there been any outreach done to both the Air Force and the Navy? And at this point, we have not, but that is a great suggestion that we'll put in our, our partner lists. So thank you for that.
M&T, and I can add that my program, not my office, but the Contaminated Site Remediation Redevelopment Program, oversees not only DoD sites, but the energy sites. And we have been working with them closely for over 20 years. From the former Fort Monmouth site, which is actually being remediated and redeveloped substantially, to just cleaning up the more rural DoD and DOE sites. So we are working with them, and we think, and they're good partners, and we think there's going to be opportunities for wildlife habitat and conserved land, but some of those sites and these facilities need cleanup before beneficial reuse in many cases. But I think it's an excellent idea. Thank you.
So Mattia, John has a question about whether we prefer one comment with multiple topics or comments per individual topic. Personally, I don't have a preference. They're going to land in the same place. Does it make a difference to you?
No, as long as it's clear which area you're talking about.
We have a hand raised. It's Mary. I'm going to go ahead and turn on your mic. All right, and you'll have to turn it on your end as well.
Yep, I think I got it. Just another quick question. So I know New Jersey has quite a lot of car infrastructure, like parking lots, roads, impervious surface. Has there been any thought of targeting those kinds of areas to meet things like the street trees and other types of goals?
Mattia, there's something with right-of-ways in one of our groups of targets, and I'm trying to remember where that fits in. Do you recall?
I don't, but yeah, I'm curious how Frank and Katie, if you guys have addressed that in your strategy.
Yeah, we think in addition to a lot of unproductive impervious surface coverage in some of our distressed communities that we show you some pictures of, there's a lot of impervious surface coverage that's actually necessary for like commuter lots, businesses, corporate campuses, and stuff like that. There's a huge opportunity for green infrastructure, tree trenches, and other stormwater management there. So no, that's a great suggestion, Mary. And we will definitely need to work with our partners who own that land and plant some trees and absorb some stormwater in those places too.
Yeah, because a lot of parking lots would be on private property. That's what makes it a little difficult. But if you want to see like good examples of private impervious cover, like being transformed into a bunch of tree trenches, a bunch of like street trees and rain gardens, the University of Pennsylvania has been doing a lot of projects like that in the last few years, and they have a whole document that I can link it in the chat that has laid that out. They've installed like tons of tree trenches on the campus just in the last couple of years, which is definitely doable. We just have to partner with different entities in New Jersey to get that done.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I was also thinking of the public right-of-way areas, not necessarily private parking lots. I know there's the complete street concepts that talks about prioritizing other forms of transportation like pedestrians and bicycles, and my urban forestry focused head that also includes a lot of opportunity for rain gardens and urban vegetation and carbon storage and sequestration in those areas. Thank you very much for addressing my questions. I'm grateful to have been a part of this process.
Yeah, and we are looking for those opportunities, Mary, right? I have done some transportation projects and provided rain gardens, new tree planting and stuff like that. So there is, as you mentioned, there are all these right of ways. Sometimes, of course, there's utilities and other things. So, there are some impediments we need to look at, but they are great opportunities for additional tree plantings, rain gardens, etc. And maybe our forestry group is looking at that since it's around the state and along transportation corridors.
Frank, right as you mentioned that the light bulb went off, and our forestry group did include that in their targets. Whenever we made the full list for the website, we had them condense it a bit because it was much longer and somewhat overwhelming. But there are right-of-way considerations for afforestation and reforestation.
Okay, thank you. I'll take a look at it.
All right, Matt, we'll go ahead and turn your mic on our end, and you'll have to turn it on your end. So Matt has their hand raised. I did just allow your microphone. If you see the mic icon at the top and you click on that, you should be able to speak. And if you find audio is not cooperating, feel free to type it in the chat. All right, sorry, Matt, we didn't get anything from you. If you want to offer something in the chat, we'll do our best to answer it. While we leave this open for just a few more minutes for anybody who might have anything they want to add, I'll just remind you all that there is a comprehensive list of draft targets for all of the land types at this link at the bottom of the slide here. That's also where we will post the recordings from the meetings. We'll post the slides, and you can come back to that, for progress after this. Thanks, Connor. That's a great suggestion for the DoD sites for a potential funding opportunity in the chat. So we'll keep the line open till about 3:10. If anybody comes up with something that they want to share, go back to the link at the bottom of the slide here for the comment form. So one question I had from Marjorie during the session was related to the comment period and, when documents will go up, things like that. So what we're looking for is comments on the draft targets. We don't plan to subsequently post a full draft document after that with a comment period. This is satisfying our stakeholder process. So it will be the list you're looking at with some possible additions from input we've received. That's been really helpful. But there will just be text filled in around it, but the real meat of the strategy is in these lists of targets for land management practices and for policy recommendations. So we're really looking for your input at this time on those items. Connor, we're glad you found us today. We really appreciate the offer to serve as a contact.
Matt, you can feel free to try to unmute again. I saw that your hand came back up.
All right, thanks everyone so much for your time. We really appreciate all of the input that we're receiving on this. We definitely want to hear what we're missing to get your feedback at this stage of the game rather than, after the document's already out there and there isn't much you can do about it. Again, this is the first iteration here, so we expect this to be sort of a living, evolving process. It would eventually be followed up with calculations of the sequestration that is occurring from these activities, you know, after we get the ball rolling. And it looks like Katie just offered one response here about the parking lots. If anybody wants to check that out in the chat. But again, we appreciate your time. Drop by our website. If you want to leave any comments there, we welcome them. And thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.